Sewing is not the hardest part of quilting, but getting the fabrics that work together well is. For some of us, selecting fabrics is the best part of quilting, but for many of us, that's the most stressful step. Why? Because you might spend hours and hours in the sewing room, and in the end, you might not even like the finished quilt, just because the fabric selection have failed you. So the aim of this video is to deep dive into fundamental principles of successful fabric selection. I devised a 5-step approach that hopefully will help you eliminate stress from fabric selection once and for all. So let's dive in. When we're selecting fabrics for a new quilt, we optimize for 3 variables: sameness, difference, and variability. And all 3 of those variables pull to different directions. That's why selecting fabrics that are balanced is so hard. So imagine we have this pile of triangles that are made out of fabric, and you can instantly see there are 2 groups of fabrics in this pile. Not 1, not 3, but 2 groups. And the thing that allows you to see how many groups is sameness within the group. So sameness defines the group. Second variable is difference, and that tells you how different the groups are. Difference is the variable that allows your ornament to shine in the patchwork. If there's no difference between group A and group B, the ornament won't be visible. But there's also a third variable that we quilters really love, and that is variability. We want to add a difference within fabrics within a group. This adds scrappiness, this adds layers, this adds complexity. So for the quilt top to look really good, you need to optimize all 3. There has to be a clear sameness within the groups, there has to be a clear difference between the groups, and in most cases, there needs to be variability within the groups. So to optimize those 3 variables, we have 3 levers in quilting. First one is color or hue. That's where all the color wheel theory comes handy. Second one is value, which is brightness or darkness of the fabrics, and that's the most powerful of the 3. And finally, we have texture, which is least powerful, but it adds depth and complexity to our work. So how do those levers work on an actual quilt? Let's make a case study and select fabrics together for this Dragonfly in the Sky quilt. While doing so, I will show you a 5-step approach to selecting fabrics that is universal to any quilt. So let's get those fabrics. The first thing when you're selecting fabrics for any quilt is get to know your pattern. And by that, I mean answer those few questions. What are the groups? What is the same within the groups? How the groups are different? And how much variability are there within the groups? Meaning how much variability you need and how much you can afford. So in this particular case, we have patchwork that serves as a background, Dragonfly applique that serves as a foreground, and border that both frames the quilt and integrates the differences between patchwork and Dragonfly. So what is the same within those groups and at the same time different between them? Patchwork has very similar hues, like one color, and is generally light. The Dragonfly has an accent color, and also its silhouette is very, very dark. And then the border has both colors from the patchwork and from the Dragonfly. But also, what makes the border different from both patchwork and Dragonfly is this tiny narrow strip of white fabric. And this white is nowhere else on the quilt. So how much variability is there within those groups, which is mainly achieved through differences in value and texture to a lesser degree. Within the patchwork, we have very light fabrics that go to pretty dark fabrics, so light to medium dark. So in the Dragonfly, we see that the silhouette is very, very dark and the wings are much lighter. And in the border, we see this pattern of light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. And it starts with the lightest white fabric and it ends with the darkest fabric that's the same as Dragonfly silhouette, which is the darkest fabric overall in the quilt. And for the texture, it's not visible here, so we will add as we please. Okay, so after this analysis, I know what is important for this quilt to work. Now I can get to the actual fabrics. Once you get to know your design, the next step is to pick the color palette for your quilt. And the easiest way to do so is to select an inspiration fabric. And with inspiration fabric, it's very easy to know that the colors are working together because you see they do. They are harmonious, they fit each other, they complement each other, they just work. As long as you stick to the palette you have in your inspiration fabric, you'll be good. I also like to buy a bit more of this inspiration fabric because then I love to use it as my backing. And it's very nice because those colors that you have on the top of your quilt will also get echoed at the back of your quilt. So in my case, I have yellow, orange, and red as my color palette. If you're familiar with the color wheel theory, you know that these colors go next to each other in the color wheel, and this is an analogous color palette. For the original quilt, I had blue and yellow as my color palette, which is complementary on the color wheel, meaning that they have very high contrast. Since this time I'm going with analogous color palette, which is very close to each other, means these colors don't have very good contrast between each other. And from the design, I know that there needs to be a strong contrast between Dragonfly and the patchwork. So from these three colors, yellow, orange, and red, I need to pick one that will be my accent color for the Dragonfly. I know I can't pick orange because that sits between yellow and red and it will result in least contrast, and I don't want that. So I can choose either red or yellow. If I go for yellow, yellow is intrinsically very light color, so the patchwork has to be dark. So red, dark reds, and oranges will be the patchwork, and Dragonfly would be yellow accent. But I don't really want this feel. I want this quilt to be very light. Therefore, I would choose red as my accent color and go for the majority of the quilt, the patchwork in light yellow and orange. So red is going to be my accent color for the Dragonfly. Once the color palette is set, we can gather the remaining fabrics. And here we get to the most crucial step, adjusting the value. Why? Because value is the strongest of the three levers. Mistakes in hue or texture adjustments can be simply attributed to taste. Failure getting the values right can literally ruin your quilt. On top of that, with value we optimize not one, but two things: the difference between the groups and variability within those groups. And these two jobs just pull to different directions. That's why getting value right is so tricky. So to pick fabrics for the patchwork, I just collected everything I have in yellow and oranges. Before we start, let's just sort yellows and oranges into two different piles. Clearly, I have more yellows than oranges. I pick also very tiny pieces of fabric because it's big enough for me to cut out individual squares, and this quilt top is just perfect to use up all the scraps you have. The quilt top needs either 12 or 24 different fabrics, and I will go with 24 because I want it to look really scrappy. Also, I want my oranges and yellows to be mixed in equal amounts, so I will pick 12 oranges and 12 yellows. I like florals, so I will add all the florals, and let's add some solids. Also, I have some fabrics that have all the colors inside. It's red, orange, and yellow already, so I want to use all of those fabrics. I have these flowers, again, very tiny piece. I think I will just match it with this bigger piece. So now I have those two piles of fabrics, yellows and oranges, and this is the starting point of my value work. To see the range of values that I actually have, let's sort those fabrics from the lightest to the darkest and take a black and white photo. The first thing that black and white photo helps us to do is to fix our sort. Some fabrics are really hard to place just looking at them in color. For instance, these high contrast fabrics, they're both dark and light. So the red will contrast with the yellow and look darker, but the white is lighter than this yellow. And it's really hard to say where those fabrics should go. So black and white photo can help to rearrange the fabrics and make sure that we more or less follow the sorting from the lightest to the darkest. So before we continue, let's be clear about what are we optimizing. And we are optimizing two things: the difference between different groups and the variability within individual groups. So these are patchwork fabrics, and with value we need to make sure that this pile of fabrics is different from both Dragonfly and the border. At the same time, we want that inside the patchwork that these fabrics would be as different as possible, so when we put them next to each other, the patchwork looks alive and not flat. In other words, we take the full range of value, we slice part of this range, and within this range, not exceeding this range, within this range, we try to be as variable as possible. So that's what we're optimizing. Now let's describe the slice of our range. So if we take the full range, that would be black and white as the extremes of the value. If we put them together, this contrast is the maximum contrast you can get between black and white. Now our quilts are something in between those two. Our fabrics will be gray value between white and black. In our case, this range is further cut by Dragonfly silhouette fabric that defines that the darks can't be darker than the Dragonfly silhouette fabric, so our range suddenly narrows down. On the light side, white is the ultimate light, and we will have white within the fabrics, like within inspiration fabric, there's a big chunk of white, so white will be our lightest color. And this also describes where our boundary with the border will be, because we will put a tiny narrow white strip around the patchwork to distinguish it from the border. So these are our two bounds. Now we need to get all the patchworks within this range and to distribute it as widely as possible. So we have the fabric sorted, and let's look how it looks. So first check, do we exceed our bounds? Are we too light or are we too dark? And within the black and white photo, we see that we are good. This fabric is not white, and here we are still slightly lighter than the Dragonfly. At the same time, I think we could still push the extremes a bit. We could get some lighter fabrics than what we have now, and we could get some darker fabrics than we have now. The further away are our extremes, the bigger contrast we have within the patchwork. So that's what we want, as much variability within the patchwork as possible to have it really dynamic. Another thing what you can notice that most of the fabrics appear quite light, and we have only a few pretty dark fabrics. And it's worth knowing that for patchwork to look scrappy and nice and dynamic range to be balanced, it is a good idea to have quarter of the fabrics light, quarter of the fabrics dark, and the remaining to be a medium. And the medium can be also divided into dark medium and light medium, so you have 4 quarters. So it is probably a good idea to include more darker fabrics. So I found those 4 light fabrics that could be lighter, and I found those oranges that could be darker. So let's include them and take a black and white photo again. Okay, so now I instantly see that this is way too dark. It's too similar to the Dragonfly silhouette fabric, so that's out. The other 2 are probably okay. Now from the lights, these 4 lights are probably lighter, but I probably don't want to have all 4 of them, because if I add 4 fabrics, I need to remove 4 fabrics. And when looking at it, I think I will not use this one. And also I will remove this fabric because these 2 are kind of similar in texture and print, and I like this print more. So I will remove this fabric. And also these 2 solids are very, very similar. This one's slightly darker, but they're basically identical. So I will remove one of them as well. Okay, now I have my lights. And from the darks, let's see how it looks with the Dragonfly silhouette fabric on top. When I look at the value, I see that there are no problems here, but this fabric is probably pushing too much. It's very similar. This one is also borderline, so I think I will remove this one because it's getting too dark. The oranges, I think probably they are okay. So I added 7 fabrics and I removed 4 so far, so I need still to remove 3 fabrics. Let's now see our numbers. So the quarter of the fabrics would be 6. So I need 6 lights, 12 mediums, and 6 darks. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think we can consider those lights. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These would be my darks. Okay, and from here to here I have the range of mediums. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I don't want to get rid of any multicolor fabrics, and I like those fabrics here in the middle. So I think I need to remove one of those fabrics because it's very similar in value. So I think I will get rid of this lightest one. And one more fabric needs to go. That's a tough one. Perhaps this, because it's also quite similar. So added 2. No, I added actually only 1 dark and removed quite a few darks. Okay, that's not good. What do I remove? What do I remove? Perhaps this fabric, because the color of it is also not so great. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 now would be those my darks. Here are my mediums and here are my lights. And I think that's more or less correct. To have a real feel on how the patchwork will look, let's divide them into darker pile and lighter pile. So these piles should be significantly different from each other, 12 darker and 12 lighter fabrics, and let's merge them to have a feel on how they will look together. This is more or less the feel that we're going to have for our patchwork, where every single fabric is slightly different from its neighbor, meaning that we have variation within the patchwork group. And this ensures that once we sew all those fabrics together, patchwork will look dynamic and interesting. So patchwork fabrics are set. Now let's move on to the Dragonfly. And selecting fabrics for the Dragonfly is way more straightforward. So what makes Dragonfly look as a single group? That is color, which means that I will need shades of red as wing pieces. And what makes Dragonfly different from its surrounding patchwork? That is this silhouette fabric. And this dark silhouette fabric takes care of the differences between the groups. So now I just need fabrics that are lighter than the silhouette fabric. Variation, I don't care about variation too much because those fabrics won't touch each other. They will be separated by pieces of the silhouette fabric. Yet I probably don't want to have everything identical in terms of value, but it's definitely less critical than for the patchwork. So basically that's it. I'm done with fabric selection for the Dragonfly. The last set of fabrics that I need for this quilt is border and binding fabrics. And the purpose of them is to frame and finish the quilt. So binding is the minimum we need to finish the quilt, and it needs to create clear boundary between inside and outside. And for that, quite often dark fabrics are used because dark fabrics create highest contrast to its surrounding, and high contrast means good boundary. So I will do the same and use the darkest fabric in the quilt, that is Dragonfly silhouette fabric, as my binding. The next thing that I need to take care of is unite the patchwork and the Dragonfly that are quite different. So to do that, I will have multiple layers of the border. So the first layer is scrappy border, and for that I will just use some scraps from the patchwork as well as some fabrics from the Dragonfly to mimic the colors of the quilt top. And this unit will be perceived mostly as red, just because it's surrounded by red Dragonfly silhouette fabric. I also want to repeat yellow and orange. So for that, I will just use some fabrics from the patchwork. So yellow will be next. And since it's very wide, it will be perceived as the main color of the quilt. And here as the orange, I would love to use this fabric with strips because it contrasts well with the yellow. And also it has all the colors of the patchwork, but I don't have enough of it. So I need to settle for something else. So I will use this fabric that also is perceived mostly as orange. I prefer it to any other fabric just because it has all the colors of the patchwork. And now by repeating all the elements of the patchwork and of the Dragonfly, I have a problem because border looks too similar to the patchwork. I really need to get a very clear boundary. And the worst thing that we could do here is to use fabric from the patchwork. For instance, let's say we don't add anything else. We just leave this fabric as our boundary. And we have this fabric also somewhere in the quilt, and this will destroy the boundary. So we don't want to have the same fabric from the patchwork touching itself. Okay, we need an edge, something that's not in the patchwork. We could use something from the Dragonfly because it doesn't touch the patchwork. It could work, but it's tricky to get it right. Also, I could remove this fabric, for instance, completely from the patchwork. It won't be very clear edge because it's similar to many fabrics, but it would be better than having this fabric also inside the patchwork. And the third option is to use a tiny white. Why does white work? Because we already have white within the fabrics. At the same time, we don't have entirely white fabric, so we won't run into the same problem as with the flower fabric. And just look, by adding this tiny piece of white fabric, we created a clear edge between patchwork and the border. And suddenly having the flower fabric in the patchwork is not a problem anymore because it's separated by this white little strip. Now, when you look at the value of the border, you see two things. First, we have a gradient of value from the lightest at the patchwork to the darkest at the binding. And this way we repeat not only the colors of the patchwork and Dragonfly in the border, but also we repeat the value range. The second important thing is that every single fabric has to be slightly different from each other to look good, meaning that there needs to be variability inside this group. And the easiest way to achieve it is to have light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. This flower fabric, unfortunately, is not as dark as I would love it to be. It's still different from the yellow and white because it is different color and different texture, but it could be much better. That's why I would love to use this strip fabric. It would be just darker and would look overall better. But since I don't have enough of it, I will have to work with my second best. So that's it for the border. Let's move on. So these are the fabrics I was planning to use for the quilt. But now let's imagine that instead of this dark red solid fabric, I would have chosen a dark red print fabric for the Dragonfly silhouette instead. And that brings us to the last lever, texture. Texture can be anything from quilting, quilting density, quilting ornament, to fabric type, fabric material, fabric thickness. That's more relevant for art quilts. And in regular quilts, texture often means fabric prints. That's what I'm going to focus on today. Fabric prints is a great way to add variability within the fabric group. And I was already doing that while working on the hues and on the values. Why? Because texture and prints in this case is the least powerful lever of the three. So when there comes to the decision hue versus print or value versus print, print always comes second. Nevertheless, I want to include texture as a separate step because there are a few very useful principles worth knowing and having in mind while selecting fabrics. So let me show you those. One thing that's really not obvious, but it always is there, is that prints usually bring additional color. Here you can see that we have white as a color in many prints, and white was not one of the colors in our color palette. And if you're not mindful about the color, you sometimes might end up with a color you don't really want to have in your quilt. The second thing is prints and solids. Prints only, it looks pretty busy. And look, it's enough to add a single solid fabric, and that already calms down the overall look of the stack. So as little as 10% of solids already can help the stack look much calmer and much more intentional. The next thing is that you should always mix large and small prints. So let me show you. Let's say we have this fabric that's really pretty, it's bold, it's shining, has high contrast, beautiful flowers. And then we have another one that's much calmer, a bit lighter, also has flowers. Both are really pretty fabrics. Now, if we combine them, it doesn't look so great. Why? The issue is that the size of the flowers is very similar and they don't provide needed contrast to each other. Now let's exchange this floral fabric with another floral fabric that is very similar in value, maybe a bit darker. It's also floral print, but the print is larger. So what we see is that it's still very busy, but it looks better. Why? Because these flowers are bigger than those. So the pattern is much bigger because we can't really immediately say where the repetition of the pattern starts. Where here we know it's like every flower is a repetition. In here, it's much bigger. So just different size of the print gives better contrast. Still, there is a problem that both fabrics shout for attention because they both have high contrast and they both have multiple colors. So if we reduce the number of colors in this fabric, this will shine. For instance, we can put a single color print that has tiny flowers, but now you can already see that this is way more visible and the contrast is way better. Just because there's one single color and our eyes perceive it as way more uniform. So these two fabrics together look much better than the flower fabric before. We can go one step further and get rid of the print completely and add solid. And this gives the highest contrast because this solid fabric is just saying the print is important and our eye just focuses to the print. So this print is not solid, but it's solid-like. Why? Because the print is small and there's no big contrast, so it looks pretty uniform to our eye. If we make a quilt only from these very bold fabrics, it will look extremely busy. So by mixing some solid-like fabrics, we already calm the busyness a lot. Now let me highlight you the importance of the print size. Once again, I will add this fabric that is very solid-like, but when we put them together, something is off. And the main thing that is off is again the size of the print. These circles and the flowers are of a very similar size and doesn't look as good as, for instance, this fabric that is also a very solid-like, but the contrast between fabrics is much higher just because the print size here is again large. So when combining fabrics, the print size matters. So the last step in selecting fabrics is troubleshooting. And it's important because you need to be able to step away from your fabric stack, look at it, and identify what sort of problem you have. To address that, we will go through several fabric stacks, look at them, and see what's wrong and how we can improve it. So the first fabric stack we're going to look at is very similar to what I've selected for the Dragonfly and the Sky Quilt. And probably when you look at it, you feel something is a little bit off. And usually when you have this feeling that something is off, but you're not entirely sure what that is, usually that's deviation from the palette. And when looking at the stack, probably the first thing that your eye noticed were those blue mushrooms and these blue flowers on those two fabrics. Why? Because blue is complementary to the yellow and it gives very strong contrast and our eye is drawn to the biggest contrast. So in some quilts, it probably would be okay to have a complementary color in such a small amounts, but in this case, these blue mushrooms will just compete with the dragonfly. And our attention, instead of going straight to the dragonfly, would also jump to the blue dots in the patchwork. So we don't want that. So let's remove the blue. Probably the next thing that you notice were this fabric and that fabric that have a bit of green in it. And green is not one of the colors in our palette, so that is off palette and that should also go. Now we're very close to our original palette, but still something probably feels off. And that something is probably those dark reds that are red, but they're a bit more bluish red or violet red rather than orange red. And let's imagine that I would use this dark fabric for the dragonfly instead of this one. And it would feel just slightly off compared to this. So the temperature of the color also matters. This is cool, this is warm, or as I like to think on the wheel, this tilts towards the violet and this tilts towards the orange, and orange is what we want. Now it should look much better, much more cohesive, much more uniform. But still, there's one very, very subtle thing, and it would be probably okay, but let's go for perfection this time. Perhaps you notice that these two yellows, they are mustard yellows, meaning that they are more green yellow. Same as with the red, just in the opposite directions. They have more green than orange. In our palette, we had red, orange, and very warm yellow, and these are cold yellows. Since they have this green, they are a bit off palette, so I would remove those as well. Some little deviations of the palette is okay. So we have these centers of the flower pink, and it's okay because these are very tiny dots. It's not the entire fabric. Also, this light fabric, it tilts a little bit towards the green, but since it's very light, this green is very small. It probably will draw our attention in the quilt, but it's still, the deviation is very small. Okay, so now let's look at this stack. Let's imagine I selected those fabrics for the background and this red for the dragonfly. If I put it on top, the problem is that the dragonfly will not be visible, meaning the difference between the two groups is too small. They are too similar. And the problem here is value. Those are dark mediums and this is dark, and this is just too close for it to be properly visible. Okay, let's imagine I take lights for the patchwork, which would give very strong contrast between the two groups. The light patchwork and the dark dragonfly would be very, very distinct. The difference would be actually too big because dragonfly would not integrate into the patchwork. It would look like a single blob on top of the patchwork. So if you have patchwork like this, very soft, you would want something medium but not dark here as a dragonfly background. Otherwise, these two parts, the dragonfly and the patchwork, are simply too different and they just look as not coordinated pieces from different worlds. So this also wouldn't work. Finally, let's take this set of fabrics that is not too light and not too dark. And the red really has nice contrast. It's not too strong, not too weak. So this looks good, but the problem here is that actually variation between individual fabrics is very, very small, meaning that the values are very similar and the patchwork made out of those fabrics would just simply look very uniform and would look like a single fabric rather than a patchwork. So that wouldn't also work. Now, if you look at this stack, can you guess what's off? And probably it was very easy to guess. All the fabrics are prints. And they are not just prints, but they are high contrast prints, meaning that they either have multiple colors and combine very light and very dark colors, or they are rather dark fabrics with white pattern, giving also very strong contrast between light and dark. Every single fabric has high contrast. And our eye always tries to drift to the highest contrast, meaning that it will always jump between the fabrics and won't know where to stop. So if this is too busy, there are too many bold prints. So let's try to smooth it out by adding some solid-like fabrics. And solid-like fabrics are basically low contrast fabrics. So if we mix it in, let's simply space those high contrast fabrics a bit further away from each other. So now this looks more balanced because not every single fabric competes for attention. And of course we can go one step further and include the solids, and they will just go additional mile. So they will just make the entire stack look even more peaceful and intentional. On the other hand, if we don't have bold prints, let's see what happens then. So let's remove all multicolor prints. So now our eye drifts to high contrast prints, like these dots or those dots. And if we remove those, so we remove all dark prints. So this is only solids and solid-like fabrics. And now it looks kind of boring. There's no enough texture, no enough contrast. So it's always about balance. It might be too much, might be too little. So finding the balance is the key. So that's all I wanted to tell you about selecting fabrics for a new quilt. Go ahead and try out those 5 steps and let me know how it went. If you have any additional tips or tricks how to make it even easier, please let me know. If you found this helpful, give it a thumbs up and also subscribe if you want to hear more tutorials like that from me. Have a great day and see you in the next one. Bye!